The old wooden doors of the church creaked as they slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the empty yard like the final judgment of a place meant to be holy yet twisted by harsh whispers and cold hearts. And she stumbled forward, clutching her baby tightly to her chest, her green dress torn at the hem, her eyes brimming with tears not just of sorrow but of disbelief that the very people she had trusted for shelter, for compassion, for grace, had turned her away with sharp tongues and pointed fingers, muttering words about sin and shame as though her very presence was a stain on their polished pews. The child, sensing her mother's despair, whimpered softly, tiny fists gripping the fabric of her dress, and she sank onto the dusty steps, heart pounding, throat aching, wondering how she had fallen so far from the warmth she once believed would surround her within those walls. For faith had been her anchor, but now even faith felt stolen from her hands, and as she rocked the baby gently, whispering that everything would somehow be all right, even though she barely believed her own words, the crunch of boots on gravel drew her head upward, and from the fading afternoon sun emerged a figure that seemed almost carved from the land itself, a cowboy, tall, broad-shouldered, his weathered hat shading, eyes that had seen storms and battles, yet still held a glimmer of mercy. His shirt rolled at the sleeves, vest dusted from long rides, a man who bore the weight of the world but carried it with a quiet strength. He paused a few feet from her, his gaze lingering not on her shame but on her suffering, not on the judgment others had hurled but on the small child trembling in her arms. And in that pause she felt seen, truly seen, as if all the broken pieces of her story had found a witness who would not turn away. The church doors behind her rattled as someone inside whispered disapproval, yet the cowboy did not flinch, did not lower his head or turn aside. Instead he stepped forward, crouched low enough that his eyes met hers, and with a voice deep as the earth yet gentle as rain, he said, "Ma'am, you don't deserve to be out here, not like this, not with that little one in your arms. Let me walk with you." She shook her head at first, fear rising, the sting of rejection still fresh, the voices of the congregation like ghosts whispering that she was unworthy. But his hand reached out steady, roughened from rope and reins, yet offered with such reverence it felt almost like a vow. And in that moment something inside her shifted, a tiny ember reigniting, and she placed her trembling fingers in his palm. Her child pressed safely between them, and he rose, lifting her with him as though to remind her she was not meant to remain fallen. Together they turned, facing the tall doors of the church, and though her heart raced with dread, he did not let go, his grip firm and sure, his presence like a wall against the scorn waiting inside. And when he pushed those doors open again, the hush that fell over the pews was thick as dust, every eye turning to them, whispers darting like snakes between lips, but he did not falter, guiding her forward, shoulders squared, his voice steady as he declared, "If this house is truly the Lord's, then there is room for her, and if there isn't, then perhaps it isn't his house after all." The silence was a storm, heavy, suffocating, yet in that silence something broke. The preacher himself, an old man with fire in his sermons but sometimes blindness in his heart, rose slowly from behind the pulpit. His eyes narrowed not at her but at the cowboy who had dared speak truth, yet there was a tremor in his hands, a softening in his voice as he looked from the child's wide, innocent eyes to the mother's weary face, and for a moment the walls seemed to breathe, the tension to ease as if grace itself had been forced back into the room by the sheer courage of a man who would not let the weak be cast aside. And as the cowboy led her to the front, as the murmurs faded and the child cooed softly, the mother felt her knees tremble again, but this time not from despair, but from something she had almost forgotten, hope, fragile yet real, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, and in the warmth of his hand she felt the promise that no matter how many times the world tried to push her out, there would always be someone ready to walk her back in. For strength is not always in standing alone, but in finding the one willing to stand beside you when the world turns cold. And as she sank onto the pew, her baby resting peacefully now, she looked up at the cowboy, his hat tilted low but his eyes never leaving hers, and she whispered a prayer of gratitude, not just for being welcomed back inside the church, but for the hand that had given her courage to step across the threshold once more, a hand that might one day mean more than protection, a hand that hinted at a future where she and her child would no longer walk alone. And to every soul listening to this story, remember that courage comes in many forms, but kindness is the one that changes lives. So if this tale touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because more stories of faith, courage, and love are waiting just for you. And your support helps keep them alive. The church air hung heavy with silence after the cowboy's words, and though the preacher had softened, the congregation still shifted uneasily, some clutching hymn books tighter, others whispering doubts that seemed to sting the mother like nettles. Yet the cowboy stood as unshaken as a mountain, his hand still holding hers, his other hand resting lightly on the back of the pew where she sat with her baby, a silent shield daring anyone to try and cast her out again. And in that stance she found the courage to lift her chin, to let her eyes meet those who had pushed her away just moments ago, though her heart still trembled with fear, and when her baby stirred with a tiny cry it pierced the quiet like a bell, drawing all eyes not to judgment but to innocence, reminding them that a child bore no shame, no sin, only purity. And the cowboy's gaze swept across the room, catching the eyes of men who prided themselves on hard work and women who clung to their own piety, and he said, his voice low but strong enough to carry, "Is this what faith has come to, folks? To shut out a mother and her child while we sing of mercy and grace? If that's the kind of worship you want, then you can keep it. But I reckon the Lord, I know, doesn't turn away the weary." His words struck like hammer blows, and though some frowned, others lowered their heads ashamed, for deep down they knew the truth in what he said. And slowly the tension broke when one older woman, gray-haired and gentle-eyed, rose from the far pew, her steps quiet but sure as she made her way forward, reaching out to touch the baby's hand with a trembling smile, whispering, "No child should ever be unwelcome here," and her act of kindness was like a spark in dry brush, soon spreading as others followed, one by one, though reluctantly at first, until the pews no longer leaned away in fear but bent toward compassion, and the mother, overwhelmed, clutched her baby close, tears brimming again, but this time not from despair, but from relief that maybe, just maybe, hearts could change. The preacher cleared his throat, voice breaking slightly as he admitted, "Perhaps we have been too quick to judge, too eager to cast stones, and we forgot the very heart of the gospel we claim to preach." And though he spoke with hesitation, the words carried weight, enough that murmurs softened into reflection, and the cowboy gave a small nod, satisfied not in victory but in seeing a door reopen, for the one who had been cast out. Yet even as peace began to settle, the mother felt a storm still within herself, for she knew forgiveness would not come easily, not from all, and whispers of her past would likely follow her. But the presence of the cowboy beside her was like an anchor, keeping her steady, reminding her that she did not have to face it all alone. And when the service ended, people filed out slowly, some offering her brief smiles or nods, others keeping their distance. But no one dared push her from the threshold again, not while he was there. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light across the prairie, the cowboy walked with her beyond the church doors, still holding her hand, and in the quiet outside, away from the watchful eyes of others, she finally whispered, "Why did you do it? Why did you risk standing against them for me, a woman you barely know?" He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes soft beneath the brim of his hat, and answered, "Because I've seen what happens when folks turn their backs on the broken. My mama once was shoved aside, left to raise me alone when she was no less worthy than any of them. If someone had stood for her, maybe her road wouldn't have been so hard. I reckon I couldn't stand by and watch history repeat itself." His words sank deep into her, and she realized then that his kindness wasn't born of charity or pity, but of a truth carved into his own soul, a truth that gave him strength to stand where others faltered. And as they reached the steps of the little house she called home, worn and weathered as her spirit had been, he stopped, tipping his hat respectfully, but his voice carried an unspoken promise as he said, "You're not alone anymore, ma'am. Not as long as I've got breath in me." She clutched her baby tighter, heart swelling with gratitude she could not yet speak, and as he walked away into the twilight, his silhouette strong against the fading sun, she felt for the first time in many weary years that hope had found her doorstep, carried not by sermons nor by prayers spoken in lofty halls, but by the steady hand of a cowboy who lived his faith in action. And that night, as she rocked her baby to sleep, she whispered to the little one that tomorrow would be brighter, that they had been given a gift in the form of a man whose courage had reignited not just their place in the church, but their place in the world. And deep within her she vowed that she would not let despair define her again. The days that followed were not without challenge, for tongues still wagged and certain eyes still watched with suspicion. But every Sunday when the bells tolled and she walked toward the church, the cowboy was there waiting, offering his arm, walking her through those doors with quiet defiance, until the whispers grew quieter, until even the coldest hearts began to thaw. For kindness has a way of wearing down walls built on judgment, and slowly the congregation learned what the cowboy had known all along, that grace is strongest when given to the ones the world tries hardest to cast aside. And so the story of a mother once shoved from the church became a testimony, not of shame but of redemption, not of exile but of belonging, all because one man chose to stand. And for those listening to this tale, let it remind you that sometimes the smallest act of courage can change a life forever. And if this story stirred your soul, don't forget to subscribe, because more powerful stories of hope, faith, and courage are coming, and your support ensures they reach hearts that need them most.